Every obituary called her beloved. Grandmothers across Yorkshire called her mean. That gap between what Fleet Street printed and what ordinary families muttered at kitchen tables for 100 years is the fault line running beneath the entire mythology of Elizabeth Angela Marguerite Bowes-Lyon. Born August 4th, 1900, died March 30th, 2002, at the age of 101. A century of living, a century of immaculate performance, and a documented record that reads less like the biography of a national treasure and more like a charge sheet against someone who damaged nearly every person who got close to her. She was the youngest daughter of Claude Bowes-Lyon, Earl of Strathmore and Kinghorne, and his wife Cecilia. She grew up between the drafty stone corridors of Glamis Castle in Scotland and the manicured grounds of St. Paul's Walden in Hertfordshire, surrounded by servants, steeped in deference, raised inside the unspoken assumption that people like her were simply better than people who weren't. In 1920, she met the Duke of York, the stammering, shy second son of George V, and after reportedly turning down his proposal twice, she accepted in January 1923. Their wedding at Westminster Abbey that April was the first royal wedding to be captured by newsreel cameras, and from that moment, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon grasped something that would define the rest of her extraordinarily long life. The camera, the microphone, and the press were instruments of power. She intended to master all of them. The abdication of Edward VIII on the 11th of December 1936 elevated her to Queen Consort, a position she was never expected to hold. George VI's death on February 6, 1952, made her the Queen Mother, and she held that title for 50 years. Half a century of enormous symbolic authority with zero constitutional accountability, answerable to no one except a daughter who would never contradict her. Her household understood the assignment. Documented sources indicate that her inner circle deliberately worked to divert the press's attention away from what one biographer calls the embarrassing underbelly of her life. The critical biography, The Untold Story, reveals that the private Elizabeth was far more complex and far less charming than her public image suggested, noting that circles had been alight for decades with the story of who she really was behind closed doors. Standard encyclopedia entries to this day omit the institutionalization of her nieces, her massive personal debt, and her documented racial attitudes. The sanitisation lasted 100 years. It held through 2 world wars, a coronation, a jubilee, a centenary birthday celebration, and a funeral that drew hundreds of thousands past her coffin in Westminster Hall. Prince Charles, in his personal tribute, called her a magical grandmother. Fleet Street printed the word beloved so many times it stopped meaning anything, and in homes across Britain, in Yorkshire, in Kent, in Glasgow, families who'd always known otherwise just shook their heads and turned the page. The first and most visible casualty of the Queen Mother's controlling hand was her younger daughter. Princess Margaret Rose was, by every account, the vibrant sister, witty, sharp, glamorous, singing Cole Porter at the piano with a cigarette in a long holder, possessing a charisma that her elder sister Elizabeth, dutiful and reserved, simply couldn't match. Historical discourse explicitly discusses the narrative that the Queen Mother ruined Margaret's life, and the evidence, laid out chronologically, builds a case that is extraordinarily difficult to dismiss. Group Captain Peter Townsend was a decorated Battle of Britain pilot who'd served as equerry to George VI and remained close to the royal household after the king's death. He and Margaret fell in love, genuinely, mutually, deeply. By 1953, the relationship was an open secret. At the Queen's coronation that June, Margaret was observed picking a piece of lint from Townsend's lapel, a tiny gesture of casual intimacy that a sharp-eyed journalist spotted and that detonated a media firestorm. Townsend was divorced, Under the Royal Marriages Act of 1772, Margaret needed the sovereign's permission to marry before 25. The Church of England opposed the remarriage of divorced persons, and the Queen Mother, whose entire identity rested on the mythology of her own perfect marriage to George VI, on propriety maintained and appearances preserved, was immovable. She expressed her opposition not through confrontation, but through silence and maneuver, a method far more insidious than outright refusal, because it left Margaret with no argument to fight against and no enemy to name. Townshend was removed from the household, posted to Brussels as heir attaché, a channel crossing away from the woman he loved, and everyone understood why. Margaret waited through grey London winters and long Scottish summers at Balmoral, because the man she loved had been placed out of reach by the very people who were supposed to protect her happiness. She turned 25 in August 1955, which theoretically freed her from the Act's requirement for sovereign consent. By then, the establishment had made its terms explicit. Marry Townshend, and you lose your royal rights, your civil list income, your place in the line of succession. On October 31, 1955, Margaret issued her statement. Mindful of the Church's teaching that Christian marriage is indissoluble, and conscious of my duty to the Commonwealth, I have resolved to put these considerations before any others. Composed words, dignified words. Behind them, anguish that would never fully dissipate. Everything after that reads like water finding every crack in a foundation. Margaret married the photographer, Anthony Armstrong Jones, in 1960. The marriage produced 2 children, then dissolved into infidelity and public acrimony. They divorced in 1978, making Margaret, with bitter irony, the very thing the Queen Mother had deemed unacceptable in Townshend, a divorced person. She became the tabloid caricature, the hard-drinking princess, the chain-smoking princess, the Mystique holidays, and the affair with the much younger Roddy Llewellyn. In 1999, she scalded her feet badly in a bath. A series of strokes left her partially sighted and confined to a wheelchair. Margaret died on 9 February 2002, at 71, just 7 weeks before her mother. The Queen Mother was 101. She had outlived the daughter whose chance at love she'd helped to destroy, and whose slow, public decline she'd watched for nearly half a century from behind the pastel outfits and the practiced smile. Diana Spencer was the second victim. The mechanism was different. The fingerprints were the same. Prince Charles had been involved with Camilla Shand since the early 1970s, but Camilla had a past, experience, and in 1973, she married Andrew Parker Bowles while Charles served abroad with the Royal Navy. When Charles reached his early 30s without a bride and dynastic pressure mounted, the Queen Mother, whose worldview was anchored in pre-war aristocratic morality that prized bloodline and unblemished reputation above all else, is widely reported by biographers to have approved enthusiastically of Lady Diana Spencer. Diana was barely 19 when the engagement was announced in February 1981. She came from an aristocratic family with deep royal connections, the Spencers having served the crown for generations. She was perceived as pliable, unsophisticated, unlikely to make trouble. In the Queen Mother's framework, she was suitable, a word that in this family had nothing to do with compatibility and everything to do with appearances. Charles didn't love her. He'd confided to friends he was uncertain. A global television audience of 750 million watched the fairy tale wedding at St. Paul's Cathedral in 1981, and none of the uncertainty made it into the broadcast. The marriage began to disintegrate almost immediately. Aboard the royal yacht Britannia during the honeymoon, Diana reportedly found photographs of Camilla among Charles's possessions. He resumed his relationship with Camilla Parker Bowles. Diana, isolated inside a palace system that treated her emotional honesty as a breach of protocol, developed bulimia, suffered from depression, and eventually began telling her own story through Andrew Morton's 1992 book, Diana, Her True Story, and then in the devastating 1995 Panorama interview. Throughout all of this, the Queen Mother operated from the shadows. Multiple biographers have reported that Birk Hall, her beloved Scottish estate on the Balmoral grounds, granite walls and gardens sloping down toward the River Muick, was among the locations where Charles and Camilla met discreetly during the marriage. Absorb that contradiction for a moment. The woman who'd destroyed Margaret's chance at love because a divorced man was deemed unsuitable was now providing her own estate as a venue for her grandson's adultery with a married woman, while his wife suffered in plain sight of the world's media. Diana reportedly found the Queen Mother's treatment appalling, a word that recurs across biographical accounts with striking consistency. The warmth projected to the cameras, the pastel waves, the delight at meeting ordinary people outside church on Christmas morning at Sandringham, none of it extended to the young woman who'd been selected as a dynastic vessel and discarded when she proved to have opinions, emotions, and a will of her own. The Queen Mother sided with Charles. She viewed Diana's public expressions of pain as vulgar breaches of the code, embarrassments to be managed, rather than cries for help. When Diana died in a Paris underpass on 31st August 1997, the Queen Mother was 97 years old and had spent 16 years watching her grandson's wife be systematically dismantled by the institution she'd spent a lifetime fortifying. She expressed the appropriate public grief, wore the appropriate black. The record suggests she felt no particular responsibility for any of it. Charles himself was damaged in a subtler way, and that damage is the reason his name appears in the title alongside Margaret's and Diana's. By his own account, the Queen Mother was his magical grandmother, the warm, emotionally available figure in a family defined by permafrost. His mother, the Queen, was constitutionally incapable of demonstrative affection. His father, Philip, was blunt to the point of cruelty. The Queen Mother filled the gap with tea time at Birk Hall, horse racing tips, the patient performance of unconditional love. What she actually transmitted was a worldview. Duty before feeling, institution before individual, appearances maintained at whatever human cost, emotional honesty, a weakness best left to lesser people. She reinforced the framework that made Charles incapable of either committing to Diana honestly or leaving her cleanly. He reportedly told Diana, on the eve of their wedding, that he was unsure of his feelings, and in that admission he was being exactly the product the Queen Mother had made. A man who understood duty, understood obligation, understood the performance of royal life, and understood nothing about how to be a human being inside a marriage. She was the warm grandmother who perpetuated the coldness. 3 victims named, 3 lives bent or broken by the same hands. And then there is the evidence that shifts the entire case from character testimony into physical proof. Catherine and Nerissa Bowes-Lyon were the daughters of John Herbert Bowes-Lyon, the Queen Mother's brother, and his wife, Fenella. Both girls were born with severe learning disabilities. In 1941, when Nerissa was 22 and Catherine was 15, they were committed to the Royal Earlswood Hospital, a Victorian-era psychiatric institution in Red Hill, Surrey. Long corridors, institutional paint, the particular silence of people who've been put somewhere to be forgotten. 3 of their Bowes-Lyon cousins, Idonia, Etheldreda, and Rosemary, were also committed around the same period. 5 young women from one aristocratic family removed from sight in an era when learning disabilities were treated as shameful genetic defects, stains on a bloodline that prized purity above the lives of its own children. What happened next separates tragedy from active erasure. Burke's Peerage, the authoritative registry of British aristocratic lineage, the reference book on every society editor's desk in Fleet Street, listed both Catherine and Nerissa as dead. Nerissa was recorded as having died in 1940, a full year before she was even committed to Royal Earlswood. Catherine was listed as dead in 1961. Both entries were lies. Both women were alive, breathing, eating, sleeping, existing inside an institution while the official record of their own family declared them gone. Nerissa Bowes-Lyon died in 1986 after 45 years of institutional life. She was buried in Red Hill Cemetery under a plastic tag and a number. No headstone, no name, no flowers, no family present. A first cousin once removed of the Queen of England, put into the ground with the anonymity of an unclaimed body, like a film prop of grief, except this was real. And the woman in the grave had a name the family preferred not to speak. Catherine remained alive and institutionalized, still breathing in the place where her relatives had deposited her and then pretended she didn't exist. The story reached the public in 1987, when a Channel 4 documentary broke through the wall of silence. By then, Nerissa had been in her unmarked grave for a year. These were the Queen Mother's brothers' children, her nieces, committed from a family she visited regularly, erased from a registry her household would certainly have consulted. When the story broke, Buckingham Palace issued a statement suggesting the Queen Mother had been unaware of the situation, a claim that strained credulity to its breaking point, given that these were the children of her own brother, and that the false Berks peerage entries required someone with authority, motive, and access to authorize them. From personal cruelty, the documented record expands outward into ideology. Multiple biographers have recorded the Queen Mother's racial attitudes, and they form a pattern too consistent to be dismissed as isolated lapses. Documented accounts describe her openly mocking those she called lesser folk, a phrase that carried both class and racial weight in her usage. Biographer reports include a specific incident involving a racial slur directed at a Japanese dignitary's face, a moment witnessed and subsequently recorded. Her private political views, as reported by those who knew her, included opposition to democratic elections in India. She viewed the subcontinent's self-governance not as liberation, but as decline, a crumbling of the natural order she believed in with the certainty of someone who had never examined a single one of her assumptions. She expressed support for white minority rule in Rhodesia, aligning herself with Ian Smith's unilateral Declaration of Independence at a time when the international community was moving towards sanctions and isolation. Each claim carries varying degrees of sourcing, some from first-hand witnesses quoted in biographies, others from consistent testimony of household staff and political acquaintances. They point in one direction: a woman whose worldview was anchored not merely in aristocratic privilege, but in an explicit racial hierarchy she saw no reason to question and no need to hide. That worldview connected directly to the most catastrophic diplomatic failure of the 20th century. After Neville Chamberlain returned from Munich in September 1938, he appeared on the balcony of Buckingham Palace alongside King George VI and Queen Elizabeth, a tableau of royal endorsement that draped the monarchy's prestige over a policy of capitulation. Appeasement was mainstream at the time. She wasn't alone in supporting it. But the enthusiasm for Chamberlain's approach, her reported friendship with Lord Halifax, and the palace balcony appearance, framed alongside her documented racial and imperial attitudes, suggest something more than pragmatic misjudgment. They suggest an ideological architecture that found accommodation with fascism less disturbing than accommodation with the decline of empire. She didn't simply go along with appeasement, she performed it from a balcony, waving. After the cruelty, after the racism, after the hidden nieces and the enabled affairs and the crushed lives, there's a final detail that makes her smaller rather than larger, which is, in its way, the most devastating thing the record can do to a woman who lived for grandeur. She couldn't manage money. The Queen Mother maintained Clarence House with legendary running costs and lavish entertaining budgets. She was a committed horse racing enthusiast whose expenditure at the track was enormous. Her gin consumption entered national folklore, and not because it was charming, because the taxpayer was funding it through civil list payments. She was, by multiple documented accounts, rude to the security staff who protected her, and dismissive of the servants who maintained her lifestyle daily. And when she died on March 30th, 2002, she left behind a Coutts Bank overdraft estimated between £4 and £7 million. The Queen reportedly settled the debt from personal funds. A century of living at public expense, capped by a bill she stuck to her own daughter. So who was Elizabeth Angela Marguerite Bowes-Lyon? The obituaries said beloved. The record says something else entirely. Margaret, whose chance at love was sacrificed to propriety, who spent 50 years in decline while her mother watched and waved. Diana, selected for suitability, discarded for inconvenience, betrayed in a house the Queen Mother owned. Charles, shaped by tea-time affection into a man who could perform duty but couldn't recognize his own feelings. Catherine and Nerissa, locked away at 15 and 22, declared dead in the pages of Burke's peerage while they were still alive. Nerissa buried under a plastic tag when she finally was. A documented pattern of racial contempt stretching from India to Rhodesia to a Japanese dignitary's face. A balcony appearance endorsing appeasement of Adolf Hitler. And a Coutts overdraft of millions, settled from the Queen's personal funds after 101 years of living on everyone else's money. For decades, families across Britain carried this counter-narrative in private, passed it down at kitchen tables, muttered it during televised royal events, held on to it through an era when no newspaper would print a critical word about the Queen Mother and no broadcaster would air one. They weren't wrong. They were just early. The internet gave them a platform. The documented record gave them proof. And the proof is what lasts. Longer than any obituary, longer than any wave from a balcony, longer than a century of carefully managed performance. She ruined Margaret, Charles, and Diana. That was the big mistake. Because the people those three belonged to, the British public, never forgot. They just had to wait for someone to say it out loud. Subscribe for more stories like this.